Welcome to SCI-Arc. I'm Hernan Diaz-Alonso, I'm the director of the school. In these kind of events, people what really want to hear is always the introduction. So we're going to give you two, so we can delay really the occasion why all we are here. There are different reasons about this, and I'll try to explain, but both are going to be very brief, particularly mine. Is with enormous pleasure and pride that we are here to see probably really the first duet that we have since we started this series between our own grand Harman and Slavoj Žižek. This is a fascinating idea in the sense of, I think a school of architecture and architecture, at the end of the day, we are in the business of cultural production more than anything else. What we do, it relates mostly to culture. It's not so much about a particular profession or particular discipline. It has to do with a much larger understanding. And clearly, these are strange times, to say the least. So, to be honest, when we start to engineer this, and Tom Wiscon and Jack Metatayo and everybody was involved, and really this wouldn't happen without Graham, that is our first distinguished professor in philosophy here in the school. Honestly, it was hard to imagine that we will be in this current context at large, which I think it makes this conversation and this debate even more appealing and relevant. So, in honor of Slavoj's love for certain popular culture and Hollywood thing, I thought there was a clip that I think is an interesting one, maybe to open my very brief remarks.
Calm down, Doctor. Now is not the time for fear. That comes later.
I'm not saying that those are Graham and Slavoj. That maybe is architecture and philosophy. But what I like about that line, and I'm not making any political implications about Bain as the speech writer for certain speech that we say these days floating around in the world, but I like this idea that this is not time for fear. That comes later. And this is, I think, is a very important part. And I think the other element, which I think this kind of conversation is, it reminds that this is not the time for fear. This is not the time for fear to express ideas, to discuss ideas, to push ideas, to keep pushing for the value and commitment that we have from opposition of ideas and friction of ideas. The other thing which I thought it was interesting is how bad we use philosophical differences in every conversation in the regular language. How a player would live over philosophical differences. Or this guy from New Hampshire talking about the State Employee Association having philosophical differences. So I thought there is something interesting in this world of alternative facts that we trivialize the idea of philosophical differences. I think tonight we're going to have a serious, in-depth conversation about what philosophical differences are and what that means for what we try to produce in a regular day. Philosophy, I would argue, has always been important and the most important in many ways, ethical and moral compass. But I think more than ever, I think for disciplines like ours and others, to look into what philosophy provides is more important than ever. I don't think there has been a more urgent times to pay attention to these conversations and debates. But at the same time, since we are a school of architecture, it's important to remind us that architecture cannot be applied philosophy. It's a different problem, and we try to take it seriously, and that's why we are so happy to have Grant Harman here to help us to go in deep. The last thing I want to comment about both of our main speakers, that they will be moderated by Anna Neimark, is that these are two thinkers that they are fearless. They don't operate in gray zones. They have clear, strong opinions, and they define different views of how things should be. And that's something that we treasure here. This is a place that we like not to navigate the gray zones. We really like to take a strong position. So I cannot be more excited to see what Graham and Slavoj will cook tonight for us. I think it could be a fascinating debate. So I would like to welcome and ask Tom Wiscon to join us here to talk to you guys for a minute. for 5 minutes or more. He is the chair of our VR program, and he's been working very, very hard together with Jack Matatayo to develop a robust liberal program here in the school, which I think this debate is at the heart of it. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here, and I'll leave you with Tom Wiscombe.
Thanks, Hernan. That was great. Okay, so I'm just going to start here, first off, by doing a more formal introduction of our guests for people who don't know them, and then do a little bit of pregame after that. So Slavoj Žižek is senior researcher at the Department of Philosophy, University of Ljubljana, researcher at the Birkbeck School of Law in London University, visiting professor at Kyung-hee University, Seoul. His recent publications include Disparities, Antigone, Against the Double Black Male. Žižek is the subject of the International Journal of Žižek Studies, edited by Paul Taylor, which is an honor usually reserved for dead philosophers. Graham Harman is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at SCI-Arc. He earned his BA from St. John's College, his MA from Penn State, and his PhD from DePaul. He is author of 15 books, most recently Immaterialism, Dante's Broken Hammer, and Dante's Broken Hammer. In 2015, he was named by Art Review as the 75th most influential philosopher in the art world. And in 2016, he was named by the best schools to the list of the 50 most influential philosophers. Anna Neimark, who is our moderator tonight, is principal of First Office. That's an architectural practice co-founded with Andrew Atwood in 2011. Her texts have been published in Log, Perspecta, and Project, and have been recently compiled in a Graham Foundation book, 9 essays. Prior to joining the faculty at SCI-Arc, Anna taught at USC and worked at OMA with Rem Koolhaas in Rotterdam and New York. She holds degrees from Princeton University and Harvard, and she is our secret weapon tonight. Okay, so I don't know, maybe this is going to be a little overlapped with what Hernan said, but I'll just go for it. So I want to talk about three points. The first is the idea of disrupting architectural education as we know it. The vocational model of architectural education based on technical skill acquisition and smooth transition into practice is not enough in these times. That is a just enough rather than a cup runneth over model, or as I prefer it, a cornucopia model. Tonight's event is an example of how we can begin to disrupt architectural education. It is part of our school-wide initiative to engage the liberal arts and critically engage other disciplines in the world in the widest way possible. We're bringing back the oral tradition, rooted in a belief that rhetoric isn't just salesmanship of ideas, but that an idea can never truly get traction until it is spoken out loud. We choose sustained and contentious debate about the issues of our time over ideas conceived of and communicated through 144 characters. Rather than offering students a cool flow of seemingly integrated topics and training, we're instead looking for new points of resistance, both in the sense of resistance to habitual modes of seeing and responding to the world, and resistance to the tropes that we ourselves identify in our own discipline. Critical thinking is one form of resistance. Aesthetics is another. Together they are powerful, but only together. So this is not, as my friend Tim Morton might say, your granddaddy's resistance. Okay, architecture and philosophy. They have a long and complex relation. One irritates another, neither bows down. It's difficult to unwind how exactly and how deeply Jacques Derrida influenced deconstructivism in architecture in the 80s, or the degree to which it might have emerged independently in response to modernism's inability to deal with contradiction and the sheer weight of its waning meta-project. Who would have thought that reviving Russian constructivism from the 20s and connecting it to deconstructivism from the late 80s would have made such a fine mutant? The effects of Gilles Deleuze's ideas about rhizomes and intensive forces undoubtedly bent architecture in the 90s, resonating with a shift already underway in discourse towards a new materialism and away from the semiotic project. In this case, though, maybe it was the computer that was more of an instigator than philosophy. We'll never know for sure. In any case, it's counterproductive to claim philosophy to be the origin of these swerves in architectural culture, as Hernan just said. Origin stories always undermine the power of specific works and discoveries made by specific authors. One interesting thing about Žižek and Harman is that they both turn their gaze back on architecture. Žižek, in his architectural parallax essay from a talk given in 2009, speaks, and later written, speaks about his belief that social struggles always underlie architectural problems, and that architecture attempts to solve or at least express social antagonism. He gives the example of interstitial space, often found in loose-fit skins of performing arts venues, as being rife with social contradictions in their fake openness, privatized public space, and elite populism. Graham, in Bells and Whistles, deals with more recent architectural developments, in particular the late modern interest in parametric design, which posits all things on a gradient of becoming, essentially degrading the discreteness and special resonance of buildings. In his more recent book, Immaterialism, he sharpens his rhetoric against materialism's insistence on constant change, contingency of all things, and how a thing works, laying out his counter-framework of the immaterial, where things are stable, bounded, not always contingent, and defined by their allure. And the final point I want to make is about style. Maybe I won't explain this drawing. Maybe it's totally clear. What do you want? Style matters. And the styles of our speakers are so different, it's worth mentioning. You'll see it in a minute. But Žižek's world, envisioned as a social struggle and as social struggle and human theater, filled with antagonism and contradiction, reveals alt-right and far-left politics to possibly have more in common than we might have imagined. His style is somehow political analyst accelerationist. He is an avalanche of questions and suspicions in every public appearance. Even his T-shirts have something to say, which they don't tonight, but usually they do. Harman's world, a very different one, expands beyond the human sphere to include all the things in the universe, tiny and massive, human and non-human, real and imaginary, in a radical ontological and ultimately post-human ecological model. Harman writes in an accessible journalistic style that is not unrelated to the way he structures his ideas. It's like he's reporting from the front, a new front that none of us knew existed before. Graham wears his T-shirt on his note cards, which he always has an endless pocket full, like a magician. Don't be fooled, they are all in order, no matter what order they're in. So I'd like to say this about style. You can't separate style from scholarship or from positions. Style is what changes the world. Style is a concrete thing, not something floating superficially on top of ideas. Especially in a time of alternative facts, authentic style is what makes a difference above all. With that, please join me in welcoming Slavoj Žižek, Graham Harman, and Anna Neimark to the stage.
I welcome all of you for the third time, our students, faculty, guests, and online viewers, to this historic debate between Graham Harman and Slavoj Žižek here at SCI-Arc. Now, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that this conversation is about to occur on the stage of Keck Hall, inside of an architecture institute, and I will ask you to bear this rather strange fact in mind. After all, our speakers tonight are not architects, not directly involved in architecture discourse. They are philosophers, and they will probably not find the setting in any way particular. To them, it is simply a stage, a public space, a platform for debate, even if one of them calls SCI-Arc one of his homes now. This conversation has been in its planning stages for over a year, scattered throughout book chapters, unpublished material, email exchanges, and other great text. It would have happened somewhere sooner or later. In fact, when I wrote to Žižek and Harman last week to consider some questions concerning architecture and politics, they quickly responded, no. We have a topic that we must discuss. It is ontology, and we will speak about objects, Graham Harman, and the subject, Slavoj Žižek. So I realized that our love for their work is not always requited. Often it's the architects who are attracted to philosophers, not the other way around. Now, I was going to introduce the three main subjects that we were going to dive into tonight, but then stopped short to consider whether Graham would find any fault with the word. So then I retyped to say three objects, as in the objects for your consideration or the objects of our attention, and realized that this word may even more quickly antagonize Slavoj. Finally, I settled on the word act, a term that enters philosophical discussions via Bruno Latour, whose actor network theory includes all situations, objects, subjects, and everything in between. It's also, of course, a term of theater, and this event is clearly meant to entertain. So tonight's evening will be generally divided into three acts, each one set to last about 30 minutes. My role is the unenviable one, to keep our two speakers to this set time constraint, and to bring them down to earth. In Act 1, Slavoj and Graham will speak briefly for about 10 to 15 minutes each to introduce their work on objects and the subject. Act 2 will transition into the form of a dialogue. Here, hopefully, their disagreements will emerge more clearly on the topic of ontology and ways in which some of their positions engage or interpret our current political climate. In the third act, we will think about a possible link back to architecture by relating ontological notions to ways in which architects and buildings come into being, the rapport between authors and modes of representation, such as reductive models or visualization of fictional reality, some of the things that we've already heard in the introductions. We will conclude with a few questions from the audience, of course. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Graham Harman.
How's the microphone? Can you all hear me fine? Slavoj has insisted tonight that we call him by his first name, and I'm going to try to force myself to do that. Usually I call famous authors by their family name because I've always worried about the borrowed glory of a false intimacy of calling somebody by first name, but we'll do as he asks. I used to tell my friends that Slavoj was the only philosopher I'd pay $100 to see live, and before tonight I had the chance to see him 5 times, and all of those were free. And this is number 6, and imagine my surprise to discover that Hernan removed $100 from my paycheck. Well, in some ways we're opposites. I'm an object-oriented philosopher, and you could call Slavoj one of the major subject-oriented philosophers, along with his compatriot, or his colleague, Alain Badiou. But there are some things that I really gravitate towards in his writing. First of all, I think philosophers should be funny. Too few of them are. And I would have to say that Slavoj is probably the first Western philosopher since Giordano Bruno in the 1500s who could probably have made a living as a stand-up comic if he had to. Now, of course, Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600. I doubt that's going to be Slavoj's fate, but in a different time, perhaps, you can imagine a situation where it could have gone that direction. Also, simply the animal energy of his writings and his public speaking. When I started graduate school in the early 1990s, there was a certain way of writing that I know he hates also, that involves putting everything in parentheses and quotation marks, and this is simply de-energizing and debilitating, and he avoids this wonderfully. He simply takes a stand on everything and challenges you to disagree. But here are some differences. You could say that Slavoj belongs to a modern tradition of philosophy, whereas I would say that I belong to what I call a non-modern tradition of philosophy that's more recent. I'm stealing that term non-modern from Bruno Latour. Slavoj would say that we are seeking a re-enchantment of the world after the alienation of modernity, whereas I would say the world was never disenchanted in the first place. We've always been fascinated by the world. We've always been entangled with it and involved with it. Another thing, an issue I have with modern philosophy is that modern philosophy is in many ways a taxonomy. It says there are at least 2 different kinds of beings, thought and world, or nature and spirit, or human and world. It starts by saying there are 2 totally different kinds of things, and they both need a different ontology to handle them properly. The human thought needs one kind of ontology, nature needs another ontology. Whereas, and by the way, I see this as an extension of the medieval taxonomy, which was between creator and created. There were 2 also basic kinds of things for medieval ontology. Whereas in non-modern philosophy, we start with what we call a flat ontology, which means we start off by assuming that everything has to be treated in the same terms. So we start off by assuming that the human being is simply an object like others. Yes, a very interesting object to us. an object that has lots of talents, perhaps, that chairs and tables do not, but an object nonetheless, and that you cannot start off by inscribing what's special about humans into the very foundation of philosophy. That has to come later. And so you have to start off, this is why we give long lists a lot in object-oriented ontology. I'll say paper, grasshoppers, the planet Mars, chemicals, and so forth. You'll find 9 or 10 of these objects in a row. It's an attempt to create that sense of flattening for the reader. All right. There's also a kind of philosophy that I would call neo-modern philosophy, which I think it describes Slavoj's position a little more accurately. I should say that neo usually is taken as a derogatory prefix. If you call somebody neo something or other, it often means that you're just accusing them of rehashing the original version. That's not what I mean here. By neo-modern philosophy, I mean the kind that doesn't stay with a simple opposition between subject and object, but that tends to assimilate the object into the subject in some way. And so this starts with authors like Maimon and Fichte, the ones immediately after Kant, where Kant said there is a thing in itself out there that we can think about, but we can never know. These critiques of Kant tended to say that that itself is a performative contradiction, because if you're thinking a thing outside thought, that itself is a thought, and therefore it makes no sense to talk about this thing in itself that's outside of thought. The thing in itself has to somehow be inscribed in the thought, the circle of thought already. You find a lot of this in Slavoj's work. You find it in Badiou's. You also find it in Quentin Meillassoux of my own generation. It also has an inverse, which I would call arch-modernism, which is where they're reducing the subject to the object, say to cognitive science, a way of trying to minimize the modern difference by letting science be the dominant discourse. And what Slavoj tells us in a number of his publications is that the way Hegel radicalized Kant by getting rid of the thing in itself is also the way that Lacan radicalized Freud, so that the unconscious in Freud is in some sense a real thing, a quasi-biological entity that's there, hidden beneath appearance. For Lacan, that's not really true. The unconscious occurs in the gaps and ruptures on the surface. There's not really a hidden place where the unconscious is. Now, what I would say is that neo-modern philosophy radicalizes Kant in the wrong way. It tends to say that the problem with Kant, this great genius, is that he allowed for finitude, this idea that humans cannot reach the thing in itself because we are only experiencing according to space-time and the 12 categories of the understanding, and so we can never get at the thing outside there. And the neo-modern philosophers tend to try to get rid of this finitude, which they distrust. I would go the other way. I think the finitude is insurmountable. I think the problem with Kant is that he left the human-world relation at the center of philosophy, and it's the only real relation he can talk about. Kant doesn't really allow you to talk about the collision of two inanimate entities, except insofar as we are talking about it, and therefore the conditions of human experience apply to discussing that. So I think what should have happened is people should have said Kant is a genius precisely because of the finitude. He just shouldn't have reduced it to the human world gap, so that we poor humans can't reach the end itself. It's a problem of the subject, of the human being. For me, the same problem happens when inanimate objects collide. To take the old example from Islamic philosophy, when fire burns cotton, the fire is not making contact with all the properties of the cotton, but only with a caricature or a translation or a distortion of the cotton. And so there's no direct contact possible in the inanimate world either, and so the same problem that happens in the subject happens in the inanimate world as well. This is one of the central principles of O, as we call object-oriented ontology. So if you want to speak about this counterfactually in terms of the history of philosophy, instead of a German idealism, there could have been a German realism at that same moment that took the path I've just sketched. And it was quite plausible because German philosophy at the time was very much under the influence of Leibniz, and Leibniz also allows for this world of non-human things mirroring each other and reflecting each other. This could have happened. So in a way, O is just trying to create German idealism 200 years after it first could have been born. All right, now realism. This is another probable difference between us. I know Slavoj doesn't like being called an idealist always, but he certainly wouldn't call himself a realist, I don't think. Realism is sometimes also called naive realism, as if there were other kinds, according to these critics. They think all the realism is naive. And this means, according to them, the idea that there's a reality outside the mind, that the mind has nothing to do with constructing. I think that's the wrong way to define naive realism. I think naive realism is the kind of realism that thinks there's a world outside the mind and I can know it. That's the first problem, because I think the real is so real that it cannot be known. It can be gotten at indirectly. It's not completely inaccessible, but it's inaccessible only through what I call allure. Something is summoning you, something is drawing you, with aesthetics being a very clear case of that. Something is summoning you without being directly accessible. That's one problem with what they call naive realism. Adrian Johnston, who among many other things is one of the best interpreters of Slavoj that we have, claims that I will be left with nothing but negative theology if I take this path. But that assumes that there's only two options. You either know something or you don't. Whereas this is what is called Meno's paradox. This is what Socrates criticizes, the idea that you already know something or you don't. I think the truth is that we are somewhere in between those. And this is the foundation for philosophia in the Greek meaning of it, that it's a love of wisdom. You never attain the wisdom. You're always somewhere in between there. And I think also this is what aesthetics is about. Aesthetics is not a kind of knowledge any more than philosophy is, and this holds for architecture as well as the arts. You obviously make use of knowledge in architecture, just as we do in philosophy, but you are not primarily producing knowledge. That's a side effect in most of what you're doing in architecture. You're producing something else. You're producing something that's not ever fully knowable, not ever fully paraphrasable in literal terms, in terms of you can say literally what the 25 qualities of this building are. You can try that, but it's never going to work. So aesthetics is very central for Triple O. And how am I doing on time, Anna? Fine? Okay. Here's another problem I have with naive realism. People always say realism is the view that something exists outside the mind. Who says that the mind is the only thing with an outside? There's an outside also when two objects interact. And I say that there's a reality outside of that interaction. When the fire burns the cotton, there's a cotton outside of what the fire interacts with. And so realism is something that affects not just us, something outside our mind. It implies also something outside of objects when they interact. So objects translate each other, just as we translate them. Alfred North Whitehead got a glimpse of this in his wonderful sort of throwback philosophy in the 1920s, but Whitehead for me is too relational. He reduces objects to their relations with other things, whereas Triple O is all about the irreducibility of objects to their relations. So, what is an example where Slavoj seems to be an anti-realist? I'll take one of my favorite examples from The Sublime Object of Ideology, which was not his first book, but his breakthrough book, the book that really made him known to a wide audience, from 1989. And that is his very interesting remarks on anti-Semitism. He makes there a very interesting claim that if somebody just says Jews conspire and manipulate, that's not quite anti-Semitism yet. The anti-Semitism is the next step where you say they conspire and manipulate because they're Jews. In other words, there's some hidden essential core that's causing the conspiracies and manipulation. Fascinating idea, but I would put it somewhat differently. It sounds there like he's saying that the mistake is in saying that Jewishness is some sort of real entity outside of all the individual cases. Now, if an anti-Semite were to make anti-Semitic remarks, you would, of course, say you shouldn't generalize, right? Jews are individual people, each with their own qualities and traits, and you can't generalize about a whole group. That is something you would and should say. However, I would take a different tack in responding to the anti-Semite. I would say that you cannot know what that essence is. And I'm going to show this by making a parallel critique of Edward Said. Edward Said, I could never say anything against him in Cairo because he was a kind of saint on campus. And I was very happy to have a major person writing in the US media defending the Palestinian side. But there's a problem with his major book, Orientalism. There are several problems, but the problem I'm going to talk about here is at one point in the book, he relies on the argument that you can't generalize about the Orient. And of course, Orient's too big a term in its colonialist use. It referred to the Middle East and to the Far East and so forth. But leaving that aside, he says at one point in the book that you can't generalize, everybody's an individual, right? There are just a lot of individuals in the Middle East. You can't make a sweeping statement about what the Orient is. But it occurred to me that that is close to the ontology of Margaret Thatcher, who says that society doesn't exist. There's only families and individuals. And the fact is, we do try to learn things about culture as a whole. When I went to Egypt for the first time in 2000, there were a lot of things I had to learn about Middle Eastern culture. You can put your foot in your mouth if you don't. You have to learn a lot of things about what can be said, what can't be said. One of my students in Cairo who spoke fluent English had a night job telemarketing to the US, and he had to take a culture course about Americans. So I got to see that in reverse, and it was hilarious. They taught him you can't ask Americans if they're married, you can't ask them their salary, all things that are very normal for a taxi driver in Cairo to ask you. So it wouldn't make much sense to say that there's no such thing as Egyptian culture or Middle Eastern culture. You should be able to say something about it. I think the problem with Orientalism and the problem with Essentialism comes when somebody claims to know it. So in other words, it's not Orientalist to say Egyptian culture is different in some ways from English culture. The problem comes when you say, we know that the Middle Eastern peoples are incapable of self-rule, and therefore they need a viceroy to come from Europe and command them. This is where the anti-Semitism, the racism, the bad essentialism come in. I don't think there's a problem with essence as such, and I think one of the problems with recent theory is it's been too suspicious of the notion of essence. It takes away the realist part of theory. Because if everything has its own character, then everything has an essence for that very reason. It's a changeable essence maybe, but it's an essence. And in fact, this is how Aristotle defines substance. Substance, another much beleaguered concept today in contemporary philosophy. The most interesting definition Aristotle gives of substance is it's the thing that can have different qualities at different times. So white is always white and sad is always sad, but Socrates can be happy one minute and sad the next. That's what makes him a substance. The most interesting human characters are often capable of different polarizations of personality at different times. The famous sinner-saint polarity. You've got Paul, who's the persecutor of the Christians and then becomes the apostle of the Christians. And I've always been fascinated by the example of Scandinavia, now known for the most humane social democracy in Europe, but they were once the marauding Vikings. So what's the proper reaction to that? I don't think it would be to say necessarily that there is no essence to Scandinavian civilization. It probably means that there is, but it's something deeper than either marauding or social democracy. Those are surface properties. And we might get into this if we come to quantum theory lately, which I know Slavoj likes a lot. All right, so let me just, do I have time for a few brief remarks before I wrap it up? Okay.
Inclusive, yeah.
All right. Now, one issue that's going to come up tonight is that objects for me are non-relational. Objects are that which resist any reduction to their components or to their outward effects. And so objects for me are non-relational. And I know sometimes Slavoj seems to agree with that, as when he was reading my immaterialism book recently, but sometimes he talks, when he's writing against Levi Bryant, he said that the subject is nothing but a pure network of relations. So I want to hear what he says about that. Architecturally, there is an implication here, and I'll refer to Patrick Schumacher again. In his huge manifesto, 2-volume Autopoiesis of Architecture, which I learned a lot from actually as a newcomer to architecture, he borrows Luhmann's terminology and says that architecture is about framing social communications. I think it cannot be that, or it cannot be just that. You're not creating communication, you're also creating non-communication. You're making discrete things with an inside, and that inside does not completely communicate with the outside. So architecture has to be, at least in large part, about non-communication. And one of my favorite moments in Patrick's book is when he says, you know, every architectural theory has its vices, and I have to admit my vice is I don't know where to put the doors and windows, because everything's supposed to be a gradient and flowing naturally, and so it becomes kind of arbitrary way to articulate the building. And I think that's a serious problem. And David Rue, in a very nice piece that he wrote in TARP, Architectural Manual, a few years ago, talked about the worry that with the excessive concern with how the building flows into its environments, gradually, gently, without any discernible break-off, that architecture could blend into ecology and disappear, that everything could become about the carbon footprint, and there could be no autonomy to the discipline. So I would worry about bringing too much relationality into architecture. And another way that relationality is usually brought into a lot of fields is to bring the socio-political relationality into it. Now, I'm not enough of a formalist to say that an aesthetic work cannot communicate with any of the socio-political circumstances. Of course it can, and there are obvious examples like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Picasso's Guernica, and the list goes on. However, I don't think that they arbitrarily include everything in their environment. It's a very selective process by which an object assimilates influences from its environment, and we have to know more about how that process occurs before we simply shoot the moon and say everything's social and political, there's nothing outside of ideology, there's nothing outside of politics. So I guess I will leave it there. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
Does it work? I hope it works also.
It works.
Yeah, okay. I see a problem today. The topic you indicated is so fundamental that I have no illusions that we will arrive at. It would be a great success if we just somehow clarify where the difference really is. Because I think the biggest problem in so-called philosophical dialogues, it's not who is right, but in what does the difference reside in the first place. And here I'm pretty much a pessimist. I think the entire history of philosophy is a history of one guy allegedly superseding the other, but really misreading him. For example, as an old Plato admirer, I claim it's clear how Aristotle misread Plato, or to go later, it's clear that Kant misread Leibniz and the previous philosophers. Fichte, Schelling misread Kant, Hegel misread all of them. My favorite example, if any guy didn't understand Hegel, it was Marx, and so on and so on. So let's just be modest, and I will just try to mark some differences. There are so many things to say. First, already beginning with that Latour thesis, we were never modern and so on. I'm here a naive, I admit it openly, a naive believer in modernity. I claim that, that with modernity, something happens at the level of science, modern science, at the level of politics at the level of subjectivity and so on, which simply cannot be dismissed as just another form of enchantment and so on. Just look at politics, whatever doubts we do have, but the whole political vision of French Revolution is something radically new. That's just one point on which I would insist. Then let's go on. Maybe one of the differences that we have is, although you have some sympathy for Heidegger, but if there ever was a thinker, I claim, who is radically historicist and transcendental, it's Heidegger. Here I never got your reference to quadruple objects, how you link it with Heidegger, because when Heidegger speaks about das Geviert, the quadruple, his point is, of course, not in the usual Kantian sense, but in more radical sense, transcendental. What do I mean by transcendental? It's simply the idea that because of our finitude, we never speak from a void. We are always thrown into certain pre-understanding of the world, which is always, they like, transcendental thinkers did phrase, always already here. You never encounter, as you know very well, you never encounter simply things the way they are. You always approach them from a certain historically specific horizon. And for Heidegger, Germans have this beautiful term, unhintergehbar, what you cannot step behind. For example, for Heidegger, each epoch is characterized by a certain disclosure of being. In modernity, objects, what is really objective, is just object of science, quantifiable, all other things are subjective expressions, and so on and so on. In medieval times, reality appeared in a different way, and so on and so on. Now, what I agree with, where I do agree with you, is that we should step beyond the transcendental circle, this circle of always already, simply is not strong enough to confront us with today's problems. Let me take the one who is for me the ultimate transcendentalist, Jurgen Habermas. When we have the threat that biogenetics will objectivize us, he pulls a simple transcendental trick. His reasoning is, but even if I objectify you as a neuronal mechanism, in doing this, I already presuppose certain rational argumentation and so on, which is a priori here, which cannot be itself objectivized in this way. So, whichever way we approach reality, a transcendental horizon is here. And to be slightly sarcastic, that's how Habermas ended up doing a book together with Ratzinger, with the Pope, you know, rejecting biogenetics. So, again, I think that transcendental approach is something very harsh, and one can even read you in a loving way, not critically, your works as transcendental in the sense that, for example, you're wonderful and your ontology is very powerful. Description of reality, it's a certain vision that is simply here and you describe. It's a kind of a priori. It's not that you just look at the world and, oh my God, you discovered it is like this. And I agree with you, here we also agree that, and here we are all followers of Quentin Meillassoux, that the transcendental dimension shouldn't be the last horizon, because then you end in this Heideggerian deadlock. We just have a succession of different transcendental horizons and so on and so on. So here I would say the transcendental problem is much stronger. But let's go on more interesting topics. I like what you said. It's a wonderful formulation about how it's not only either subjectivism, we constitute reality, or reality is out there unknowable, or reality is out there we can know it. My position would have been here the fourth one, maybe more subtle. Yes, I agree with you. Reality is out there impenetrable. We cannot ever fully get at it. What I would have done, and probably you would disagree, is to add an additional, sorry for the implicit obscenity, turn of the screw, and to add that I always was fascinated by this wonderful saying of Hegel. It's not literally like this, but more or less he says it, that the secrets of the Egyptians were also the secrets for the Egyptians themselves. That is to say, I don't think there is a reality in itself which is just impenetrable to us. What if, and that's how in my naive way I read one of the lessons of quantum physics, what if this impenetrability is, and I mean this in the most radical sense imaginable, a feature of reality itself. Reality is not just out there, we cannot get at it. Reality is in itself flawed, imperfect, antagonistic, it's incomplete in itself. That's why, if I can tell another story, probably you know it, which I love it, the best quantum physics joke. I read this in some simple introduction to philosophy. It's my favorite philosophical narrative. The idea is this one, to understand, and this is the big conflict in philosophy, what are the ontological consequences of quantum physics? They claim, imagine a video game. You move in it, and you see some trees in the background, a forest. You cannot go there and see the forest, the trees, from close up, because simply the game is not programmed in this way. If you come too close to the trees, you just see some vague dots, contours. Why? Because it's not part of the game, universe the way it's constructed, that you can go there. So in this wonderful reading that I like, it goes on like this, that the lesson of quantum physics is that God constructed our world like a lazy computer designer. He said, oh, in the same way that in a computer game, you know, it happens on a certain field where you kill Pokemons, fight, whatever, but you are not meant to go back close to that door, or the house, just the outside is constructed, because, so why should God lose time constructing the inside? And the idea, it's a wonderful, ironic idea, it's a good philosophy, is that we, as it were, caught God with his pants down. God thought, that's this ironic reading of quantum physics, God thought, oh, these stupid humans will never go beyond the structure of atom. So we can leave it ontologically incomplete. Why should I lose time constructing? But we were a little bit too bright for God. You know, we went there and we found indeterminacy and so on and so on. And that's the big difference between Heisenberg and Bohr. Heisenberg still thought that indeterminacy is just epistemological. We cannot have it both ways, velocity and position, but in themselves particles have both properties. Bohr goes further, they don't have. So that would be my, as it were, addition, that this imperfection is part of reality itself. Reality in itself is, in this sense, imperfect. It's not that there is full reality out there, we just don't get it. I mean, I'm not denying that there are aspects which are unknown to us and so on, but that, again, imperfection is out there. The second thing I would add here, I mean, I'm so sorry, stop me when I speak to you because I have so many things to say. Okay, let's not get lost here. Let's go to the topic of subject. I always think, maybe I am wrong, that the problem with O is for me that, okay, it's easy to say subject is ultimately just another object. In a certain way, of course it is. I mean, we don't exist without bodily substance and so on and so on. But what I would have said is that modern subjectivity is not simply a meta-actant, meta-agent, like an object which or who doesn't want to be just an object but wants to posit the entire world and so on and so on. Subject is, for me, I don't have time to go into it, it's a complex topic, something much more paradoxically, it's more an impassive entity. It's, in a way, this failure, lack of being, in a way, coming out to be existing. Which is why subject for me is not an all-powerful agent. It's just a certain, at its most fundamental, subject is for me a certain, if you want to, structural deadlock, impossibility, passivity. What do I mean by this? Let me go on here. For Lacan, subject does have always an object that it is. It's just that the paradox of subject is that the subject is an object unavailable to itself. To be a subject means radically not to know what for an object I am. And it's not just this. It's that this surplus of not knowing has to be embodied in an additional paradoxical object called by Lacan object small a, the object call of desire, and so on and so on, which is why I will talk too much, I'm afraid, which is why for Lacan, you know, when people think, oh, for psychoanalysis, object of desire is forever eluding. Yes, but that object is not out there, I cannot ever reach it. That object is myself. Subject, which is why for Lacan, the ultimate subject in sex terms is a woman with this eternal hysterical question, tell me why you love me. It means tell me what for an object I am, but of course you cannot ever answer it. Object, the true enigma, psychoanalysis has here a wonderful theory of subjectivity. The true enigma is a small child, he or she sees that he or she is manipulated by parents, they want something from you, they play their traumas through you, but it's never clear to you what they want from you, what you are for them. This abyss defines the subject. So subject is not mega strong, subject is, I agree with you, this is my scene for you, not one among the objects, but not in the sense of we have an objective world and look, that crappy human being wants to be everything. No, subject is for me rather an effect of limitation. Subject means we are in certain horizon, we cannot move beyond. Now I come to another crucial point, I wonder if you would agree. Reality, real. Here, and I find an echo with what you were saying about this, how the thing in itself, it's not that it's out there and then all this naive, in the bad sense, topic, can we grab it or not? We can, but not directly. We can grab it through the very structure of failures to get at it. And if you allow me to conclude slowly, then I have just one more remark to give you an example which I used maybe about 10 times in my books, but I think it's a perfect one. From Lévi-Strauss, in one of his best essays in his Structural Anthropology, Do Dual Organizations Exist? Lévi-Strauss reports of his experience with some, I think it's even North American, Indian, Native American, I hate the term, it's more racist, I think, than Indian. I spoke with my Indian friends, they all tell me the same thing. I much prefer to be called Indian than Native American. If I'm Native American means what? And you are cultural American, same nature. If I'm Indian, called, at least my name is a monument to white man's stupidity. So who thought they are in India? So what I'm saying is that this is what Lévi-Strauss reports on. He went to a certain village and asked the people there, inhabitants, tribal village, draw me the map of your village. And he noticed that he got two totally different drawings. One was a kind of a hierarchy concentric, the sanctuary with all the rich people's huts and so on in center, and ordinary members around. The other one was more dualist, rich ruling priests on the one side, the other. But then his idea was, but it's simple to establish what is reality. You take a helicopter, you took a photo and you see how houses are really disposed. So in this sense, you can compare these wrong images with reality. And you can get at it that none of them fits. But then Lévi-Strauss says something wonderful. He says, the point is not that these two images don't fit reality. Their truth is in the way they miss reality. Because in the gap that separates these two images, this very gap, this failure to represent properly social reality, tells you the deepest truth about social reality. That it was class society at its beginning, these two drawings, which both falsify social edifice, register the growing social antagonism. So you see how, although none of them fits reality, the truth is the social antagonism which is registered in this very failure. And coming back to anti-Semitism, that's why I love Lacan's saying, I again often use it, that, I'm sorry, it's a little bit male chauvinist, I could provide to you another version, that if we have a pathologically jealous husband, and even if all his suspicions are true, his wife is sleeping around, blah, blah, his jealousy is still pathological. Because the true point is not, are my obsessions about my wife true or not? The true point is, why do I need this pathological jealousy to maintain my identity? And I claim that would be my approach. It's exactly the same with anti-Semitism. If, let's say I'm in Germany in 35, I want to debate with okay, not Nazi friend of mine, Nazi guy, the truth about anti-Semitism. The moment I limit the debate to, are Jews really like that, the way you claim, I'm lost. Because if you approach it in this way, the result would be a compromise. Yes, maybe you anti-Semites exaggerate a little bit, but you have a point. Like anti-Semites claim Jews exploit us Germans. Well, up to a point, this was definitely true. Many Jews were rich in a formal sense, they did it. Jews seduce our girls. Well, I hope they did, and I hope the other way around. And you know what I mean? What makes Nazi anti-Semitism pathological is not, is it true or not, what they claim about the Jews. It is, why do they need anti-Semitism to assert their identity, their political vision, and so on and so on. And here I would define truth as opposed to simple knowledge. At the level of simple knowledge, you ask, anti-Semitism claims this, that, is it true or not? But okay, that's the next point. Now to conclude, yeah, immediately. Just one more point, because I have many others. Surprisingly, where we do agree, as we already established, is that I'm also like you, and it may be surprising to some of you, totally on your side against this absolutely predominant doxa today. Whenever you have a debate, I agree with you on the one hand, as you pointed out about Egypt. I mean, this cheap historicism, in the sense of, you know, whenever, that's one safe strategy in today's thinking, whenever you have a principled debate and you are losing, if you take recourse to this cheap historicism. Like, I've been to many feminist debates where the side which was losing said, but wait a minute, woman doesn't exist. There are only prostitutes, wives, single mothers. Which, you know, this cheap relativization, particularization. I totally agree with you. Universality has a certain actuality and so on. Second point, where I agree with you, is this immobilism. Because the other doxa of today is things are dynamic, every fixation, every fixed identity is something which is just a temporary reification, fixation. No, I agree with your wonderful formulas where you claim that, in a way, identity precedes activity. I just would give to it maybe a further twist, so that I don't lose time now. Let's go to your key point, reduction of objects to relations. What would you go as far? Maybe here is the understanding. I agree with you, objects cannot be reduced to a set of relations, especially actual relations. There is always an excess. But I claim, nonetheless, this excess can be generated through relations. Let me take an example similar to your East India Company. Let's take communism.
Right.
It's a cause, which it is totally clear that communism as a cause, and I'm very critical towards it, although I still consider myself a communist, communism as a cause exists only insofar as it is practiced, actualized, debated among humans. It is this paradoxical entity, all social causes are like this. They exist only through incessant activity of individuals. But nonetheless, I agree with you, they cannot be reduced to it. That would be my paradox. They can totally depend on relations, but they have an excess. For example, it is, where would be the in itself of communism? Although communism began as the idea of equality, transparency, and so on, it's totally legitimate to ask the question, but isn't there another hidden side of communism? Was Stalinist deviation really just a secondary mistake, or was it an actualization of something that was already originally possible in the idea of communism, and so on and so on? So I don't get it. For example, let's take a case of communism. Isn't it something that, although it is fully rooted in relations, it is alive as an idea only insofar as people debate it, fight for it, and so on, it still has an in itself. But it's a paradoxical in itself, which, again, that's the paradox I would insist on. It doesn't exist outside relations, but it's posited by relations themselves as there in itself, as something transcendent, getting over them, and so on and so on. Okay, I have many other things to say. I will not now lose time. For example, when you mentioned objectivity and so on.
Slavoj, I'm going to interrupt.
I already told her before that he should act as if she is a domina with a black leg, and you are now whipping me, and I agree. Okay, I stop. Sorry.
I will be Stalin tonight, and I will try.
And what are we? Who is Bukharin? Who is Trotsky? Who is?
Actually, if somebody were Trotsky, we would have to erase him, because in all of the images, as we know, he was in fact erased from history, from all the photographs. So there must be something there to talk about.
Can I make a brief remark?
Sure.
You will love it. Precisely with the case of Trotsky, I agree with you. You know what was Trotsky's mistake in the early and mid-20s? No. He was too much abstract in the bad sense, not in your sense, essentialist. He did not see how to gain power. You know, Stalin was very bright. You know, just in 23, he nominated over 100,000 of mid-level bureaucrats and so on. He knew that power, and Trotsky was extremely arrogant. Trotsky came to Politburo session to boast with Flaubert in French. He was really like, I don't care. And then all of a sudden, in late 20s, Trotsky discovered he's like that cat above the precipice, you know. He looked down, there is nothing. He fell down. So this I deeply appreciate, in contrast to what you think. I think that with regard to what I think subject, which is precisely an inhuman abstract subject, I cannot find anything that would more fit to my notion of subject than what, for example, somebody like, although I know your differences with her, Jane Bennett describes as this, a transhuman assemblage and so on. I have no problem with totally asserting that. Okay. I have no problem. I'm not humanist.
What is assemblage? Can you speak to this?
Assemblage.
Maybe some of it's...
Yes, this is the theory that things are built together out of many components to form one thing.
Which are relatively independent,
yes,
no?
That's right.
Like, as we already talked before, Trump is an assemblage. It's crucial to understand him that, in the sense that he built his relative hegemony through assembling elements which have relative independence, a certain working class populism, a certain this, a certain that, and so on. And it's inconsistent, obviously. But beware, this inconsistency is his strength.
Before we get into Trump, can I answer some of the points from
Yeah.
your speech? Because there were so many interesting things there. I was going to maybe address 3 if I can. The first one, I'll respond to the one about the essence of communism. First of all, there's a question as to whether there is such a thing as an essence of communism, or whether we're talking about different phases.
I'm good essentialist. You're no historicist, relativist.
No, not at all, not at all. Remember, in the book of Immaterialism about the Dutch East India Company, I at least considered the possibility that there wasn't just one company, that it went through several different companies under the same name. I determined that, in fact, there was just one company, it was one thing.
I obviously agree with you.
Against
In the
Leibniz.
same sense, I think there is one communism.
Okay, all right,
It's
there might
too
be.
cheap to say Stalin falsified it or whatever.
Yes, that's right. Also, essences for me don't necessarily have to stay the same over time. They can develop.
Absolutely develop with you.
So
I agree with you.
It's not bad essentialism that there's one platonic form that everything copies
Yeah.
forever. I also talk about symbioses in my book, which are kind of in between detailed changes and developmental changes. So I think you'd have to look empirically at an individual case, like communism. You'd have to be a historian working from a triple
No, but
background.
would you nonetheless agree my central point was exactly in your sense? Communism, precisely as a universal movement notion, has an in itself.
Yes.
It's legitimate to ask where it was impenetrable to itself,
Sure.
what potentials it didn't actualize.
It's not a meaningless question. Some people treat it as if it were, and it's not. To ask, what could it have been? What is it really about? And of course, every object has multiple objects that make it up. So communism has parts too, just like any other object.
Sorry to interrupt you, but here again I deeply agree with you. I would link this to that your wonderful notion of proximate failure.
Yes.
Okay, you wanted to say something.
No, I want to talk about that. Proximate failure. I have the idea in the book of Materialism that one of the ways you recognize real objects is by looking for failures, not successes.
Absolutely.
Because if something succeeds too easily, it's probably just part of the environment. It's probably just fitting in.
Yeah.
When something fails, you know that it's a bit out of sync with the environment. And so I talked about that in a few cases of the Dutch East India Company. In the book I just finished the other day for Penguin, an introduction to Triple O, for Pelican actually, I used the U.S. Civil War as an example. And when I'm talking about Grant and Lee as the 2 great generals of that war, I was looking at their failures, of which there were many prior to their successes, which I think was a proof of their greatness. The fact that they had these failures.
Do you buy the theory which always intrigued me? I'm sorry, but it's such a nice conversation.
No?
Do you buy the theory that at Gettysburg it could have turned otherwise?
Yes.
Because Grant forgot to put artillery on some hill there.
It was Meade. Grant wasn't in the east yet. Grant was still out west. But yeah, Meade could have put the artillery.
That's the key. It could have turned...
The South could have won if Pickett's charge had succeeded, and Meade could have also chased down Lee and destroyed his army and ended the war. So there were several things that could have gone differently. It was a very contingent battle. However, I think the other battles, 2 of them are more important in particular, but that's another issue. We'll have a civil war.
No, but you know what I wanted to ask you? Sorry. Yes. No, a very precise question concerning this. I think what interests me especially are not only this approximate failure in the sense of alternate history, and I'm also like you addicted to them, you know, all the bullshit that we get now, Men in the High Castle, SS, Great Britain, I'm an avid viewer of that. But isn't it also the other way around that often we get false opening in the sense of we think that something is possible and it was just an accident that it didn't happen, but it was a deeper necessity. For example, here I remain an old-fashioned half-Marxist, opposed to what my good friend, very dignified person, the Catholic Derridean John Caputo, he claimed, why be against capitalism if you imagine a capitalism which, like Sweden in the 60s, does welfare, this, that, and so on, that all this would be possible. Well, I doubt if this is possible. I think one of the tricks of politics is that something that appears as mere contingent failure, oh my God, we could have done that, but we didn't. A deeper analysis of what you would call in itself can also discover not only that there was an option to do something else, but that what appeared to us as an opening really was none, that it couldn't have happened. So here we should do a complex analysis. You agree, no?
We should. And in the Dutch East India Company case, it was the geographical points that were inevitable. There were 2 straits in Indonesia that had to be captured by somebody. So that's one
But
example.
can I ask you a Lacanian deep psychoanalytic,
Sounds great.
psychologizing question?
Yeah.
Because I love that book. I even told him before that, you know, in my communist universe where you don't have free reading, these official grey brochures are distributed to you, printed like Mao's Red Book in 10 million copies. In my communist empire, your immaterialism would be like distributed from elementary, and people would be sent to Gulag if they forgot to read your book. No, but what I want to ask you is, like, what attracted you to that stupid East Dutch company? What was the particular cause of desire there?
The particular cause is that Leibniz makes fun of it and says that it's a pseudo-object because it's just a bunch of different parts together, right? He says that in the letters to Arnaud. So I wanted to say, no, the Dutch East India Company is an object. And this is one thing I don't like about the whole Aristotelian tradition, is that they use nature as the criterion of reality. If something's natural or simple, then it's going to be real. Whereas we need to be able to talk about airplanes and universities and societies as objects.
And
now,
non-existing things.
Yeah.
But at least in a way, I think, don't you think that not only is their approximate failure, but something that did not happen but could have happened, can as such as failure exert a terrifying influence. So I would go even further here than you. Like the whole generation could be ruined by something that they should have done, but they didn't do it.
sure. Yeah, there can be failed historical tasks, I think.
Yeah, and they can ruin your life for decades and so on.
Biographically too, right? Individuals can ruin their
So
lives.
again, here, you know, my problem with your immaterialism is that, to be very brutal and cynical, what you call immaterialism, I'm almost tempted to call materialism, you know. I'm not that primitive materialist who thinks to be materialism, it must be something that you grasp and so on. What I call it's just, it has to be in some sense contingent, open, that's enough for me. Materialism has nothing to do with matter for me.
Right, but remember, I quoted Levi Bryant asking them, why do you call it materialism? He was asking that about you in particular. What's the point of calling it materialism if it involves nothing material?
Yeah, because again, for example, again, look at quantum physics.
Okay.
It's in a way matter without matter there. Waves, are they material, in what sense, and so on. And why is it materialism? Because it's a certain contingency, openness, and so on. It's a certain purely formal structure, non-teleological, whatever, contingent, that defines materialism for me.
All right.
It doesn't have to be some hard... Would you agree with this beautiful idea that came to me that paradoxically, in 19th century still, materialism meant brutal, tasteless reality. But today, and that's why I have here, you will kill me, you will hire a guy to break my fingers, some mafia friend, because that's my problem with Tarkovsky, the director. He's so spiritual, but at the same time a brutal materialist. You know, for him, Tarkovsky, spiritual experiences when you even put your head into mud and so on and so on. So today, and it all began with Heideggerian finitude, is that idealists emphasize our limitation to body and so on, while materialists today have this freedom to move in total immaterial abstraction. But okay, let's get away. Strike back, go on.
All right, materialism. The point for me is that matter, of course, means the unshaped material, the mother etymologically, and I don't think there is such a thing. Right?
I agree totally.
Okay, right, there are forms. So what would be the value of using materialism? I think usually the value is that it has a kind of leftist political cachet, that it has to do with the Enlightenment, and it has to do with critically tearing things down to the ultimate...
correct you, and you will agree with
me.
Even here, and you will agree with it. Right. Things are more complex. For example, my other beloved, you see the depth of my Stalinist taste, Robespierre. He opposed materialism. You know why? Because for him, it didn't have this leftist connotation. For him, and he was right, I claim, materialism was a brutal ideology of aristocracy in decay. So even this, you are too close, you buy too quickly this idea that materialism is always necessarily associated with the left. It's not necessary.
No, it just has often been, you have to admit. And,
I do, yeah.
Okay, and there are two kinds of materialism. The traditional kind is you're reducing a thing to the ultimate matter of which it's made, and it generally was particles moving through a void. There's other variants of that. But when people talk about materialism today, they're talking about the other reduction, the upward reduction, that everything is contingent, socially constructed, that it involves our practices rather than ideas. And I don't really see the point of either of those because they both distract from the object which is in between those two extremes. Right?
I agree. I have no problem with that.
Just a
Here
vocabulary
I have no problem.
Okay.
When I take power, you will go, if you will go to Gulag, it will not be for this claim.
All right. I wanted to say something about Heidegger also.
Perfect.
And then something about quantum theory, maybe.
Yeah.
It was very interesting that you were making a criticism based on Heidegger, because I always wonder about you, how Heidegger fits into your narrative of the history of philosophy. Because you are in many ways a Hegelian, and many Hegelians will say that Heidegger is just a neo-Kantian relapse into transcendental philosophy.
It's much more complex.
Yes,
Heidegger is no matter how we hate him politically,
yes,
unfortunately, he is the real thing. He is one of the great philosophers. But sorry.
So what do you get in him that you don't get out of Hegel?
Sorry?
What do you get from Heidegger that you don't get from Hegel, since you find so much in Hegel compared to many people?
Well, I'm here pretty much open. Do you get everything from Hegel? Hegel has certain limits. I'm very open here. For me, you know what interests me so much in Heidegger, and you should be interested in it. The proof that he is the ultimate, for me, transcendental philosopher, not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense that we are condemned, constrained to a certain historical horizon meaning of being. And all we can do is hope for or await, lay the foundation for another. And he, you know that in some of his works, from early ones in late 20s to his last seminar of Heraclitus, he simply admits, he says, okay, we have material objects. It's clear that the horizon of being, the way the meaning of reality is open to us, doesn't create these objects. So, and then he asked this naive question, so how do objects exist outside the horizon of being, which is our way to apprehend them? And he admits it's a totally open question. He doesn't have anything to say about it.
Yes, and that's the problem that he and Husserl shared, is they both considered the reality as a kind of pseudo-question, right? Because we're already, it's already outside of ourselves.
Heidegger admitted it at the
yes,
end.
he did.
The question persists.
Right. Now, you asked what I'm getting out of Heidegger. Now, I admit that he's a transcendental philosopher and in terms of his self-conception. I think he sees himself that way, especially in Sein und Zeit. But what I think happens is something in the tool analysis that he doesn't quite realize that takes us in another place. You get the tool analysis, everything's working flawlessly, and then something breaks. And so you notice for the first time the floor that I was relying on had
collapsed.
collapsed.
Here you have again your stupid proximate failure.
Yes,
no?
that's right.
Sorry.
That's right. Now, the usual reading of this is that praxis comes before theory. First we were using it practically, and therefore it's connected to all these other things, and now it's theoretical because it broke. The problem is that theory and praxis aren't different enough as I see it. Both theory and praxis are translating the object into their own terms. One is conscious, one is not conscious, but it doesn't really make a big difference, I don't think. And too many Heidegger scholars have read that as being the key difference. Praxis comes before theory. I think what's actually happening is...
That's why, do you also oppose, although he's a nice guy, Dreyfus's being in the world?
I do.
Is this the ultimate, almost pseudo-Marxist practice interpretation of Heidegger?
Yes, he says that the background is something like a sociological understanding, so that Japanese babies are raised differently from American babies. That doesn't go far enough.
Absolutely.
What's going on there is that there's something deeper than theory and praxis, and I think Heidegger could have been talked into that. What he probably wouldn't have agreed with, of course, is the idea that I have that there's something deeper, even in inanimate causation, because he had no way to think about that at all. Two things smashing into each other where Dasein was not there at all. Heidegger has nothing really to tell us about that. He's enough of a Kantian that he's talking about...
what he would say, I agree with you, is that, okay, two things, of course, can crash out there, but the only way for us to make sense of it is to read it within our hermeneutic horizon and so on and so on.
But I don't think that's true.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think, Graham, you bring up the story of two stars or two asteroids colliding near a distant star, and there is an astronomer who captures the image in a photograph. How do you describe these different, you would call them objects, different relations? And can we insert another kind of participant, let's say? So here, to kind of bring a fourth, maybe a fourth in, and this is where I would like to maybe transition us back a little bit to Earth, to say that there's not only an astronomer with a camera out there in space, but also, let's say, the eye of somebody, an eye of a subject, an eye of somebody, let's say like Trump. Trump is watching. Let's say Trump Trump, the French would say l'œil, trompe-l'œil, out there, and producing a kind of, another kind of narrative, let's say, about this event. An alternative, perhaps, reality. How would you begin to describe now this quadruple looking at each other?
I'm trying to avoid the temptation to unload on Trump right now.
But Trump would have probably read it as, something sexual, two bodies hitting each other.
I think in a way, well, it comes back to a couple of concerns that were already brought up. One concern is there such a thing as a subject without let's say, an object?
No,
or
no,
is there such a thing as a subject who is a kind of, what did you call it, a kind of collage, not collage, but assemblage of things, and how do we produce a sense of reality? What does it mean to...
Interesting, and for me, reality is a more important word than truth, because truth to me implies that somebody thinks they can get it. It's not just out there, but they can get it. Whereas reality for me means that you're doing something, and then there's the proximate failure that's alerting you to something that you're doing wrong. And I think that's why I wasn't so happy with the narrative about post-truth politics. Because who really had the political truth to begin with? But I think we're in a phase of post-reality politics. And Berta Latour wrote an interesting article about Trump that you can read in the Los Angeles Review of Books online for free, where he made an interesting case. He said Trump is not a fascist, because at least as Latour reads fascism, it's a kind of fake attempt to bring back the Greek and Roman polis combined with technology. You agree? Oh, good. And he said what Trump really is an escapist. Because what are really the political issues? Climate change, refugees, and he's simply pretending they don't exist. And so it's a denial of reality more than an attempt to say an untruth. He's not making contact with political realities that we need to be dealing with right now. So that's probably a better way to, I think I'm persuaded by that.
Perhaps that's the mode of operation, but then there is a kind of audience on the other side who might not be able to distinguish between, let's say, the photograph and the fiction.
But back to Trump, sorry. I agree with this description, and I also agree that Trump is not a fascist. You know why? Because would you agree with this? The majority of leftists are, I agree, I'm here very critical of most of them, are often lazy, which means when there is something new emerging and they see it's bad, but they are too lazy to really think what is happening, the easiest thing is to apply a non-term. Oh, it's neo-fascism, fascism, and so on. It's not. Even I claim, look, we have to analyze all this. Like they claim, oh, Trump dismissing immigrants or European New Right, it's the same as Nazi anti-Semitism. No, it's not. Moishe Postone, the Chicago Marxist, otherwise I don't often agree with him, pointed out nicely the difference. For the Nazis, Jews were not simply out there invading us. Jews were already here in Germany, the secret masters pulling the strings. While nobody claims immigrants invading, I don't like this term, I sympathize with them, Europe are secret masters and so on. It's a totally different logic. So again, here I read your point about failures and so on. What I'm afraid of is, again, escapism can be very effective politically. Even if Trump is an escapist, it can work for a couple of years.
Couple of years?
Even more, yeah. So my point is, don't try to avoid what I call, although I love him, I often watch him, Jon Stewart syndrome, or we are so much wiser, we make fun of Trump and so on and so on. Well, we make fun of him, but he may have the last laughter, at least for a couple of years.
Maybe a question is then, if he's...
Trump?
If Trump is so good at making reality unfamiliar to us, and I'm here now coming back to some of the terms that maybe come up in conversation, there is a kind of defamiliarization, and this is something that, Graham, we've talked a little bit about Shklovsky's term, astranение. If this is already...
Usually they translate it, extraneation, I think.
Extraneation,
no,
as opposed
the reason
to
is to avoid alienation.
Right, but estrangement might work?
Estrangement. Let's say estrangement.
Yes.
If this is, let's say, happening at the level of a kind of political message, isn't life today appearing more like art? If that is a technique of art, and all of a sudden it is in life, what are we to do with this?
I've always been really moved by a remark by the novelist J.G. Ballard, who said that the role of the artist has reversed in our time. He said, in the past, the artist produced fictions. Now we're surrounded by fictions. The artist has to produce the reality. And so I think it's easy for Trump's people to produce all these alternative narratives, alternative facts. But ultimately, you have to have a politics that's believable because it's grounded in some reality. So the
But
fictions alone.
what is then the representation of reality? Because if reality has a certain modality, let's say, certain kinds of formats, and let's say we're meant to produce now reality instead of fiction, what are the techniques for doing that?
Haha.
Yeah,
No,
that's.
I graciously allow you to answer this one.
One of them is looking for places where things are failing.
Absolutely, right. I would have followed the antagonism. Ideology is for me to obfuscate the antagonism.
Yes.
To project it onto an external enemy and so on and so on. Yes. Sorry, go on.
No, that's my best answer.
No, where we should agree again is, I hope we do that. Although, as you would have put it, I agree with you here, there is no direct access to reality.
Yes.
So we shouldn't play simply the game, that's ideology, we have a direct access. But nonetheless, not everything is simply ideology.
That's right.
It matters how much you register the very inconsistencies, cracks, failures, and so on and so on.
Do you think I was fair in worrying that you are identifying ideology with realism? Is it more complicated than that? When I made the remarks
What do
about
you mean by
Anderson?
realism here?
Well, it seems in Sublime Object of Ideology like you're ascribing to the Antisemite a realist metaphysical position. That the problem is they're saying there really is Jews out there that have an essence, and that's where anti-Semitism comes from. And what makes me worry about that is it makes it seem like you're blaming realism for being a form of ideology.
I see. Okay, I would have to go more in detail, but
Okay.
I share your fear here. You know where
I have a follow-up.
Sorry.
I have a follow-up after.
Okay.
I'm sorry. You know where I share your fear, but I would complicate things.
Okay.
What I mean by criticizing realism is this. And that's where comes what I mentioned there, this secret essence of the Jew. Look, Ernesto Laclau, my otherwise good friend for some time at least, claimed that an anti-Semitic subject always gets caught in a paradoxical tension. You cling to anti-Semitism, Jews are evil, and so on and so on. But then you happen to live with close to a neighbor who is a kind old Jew, and then you cannot bring the two together. Your ideological thesis, Jews are evil, and the kind old Jewish gentleman who is there. I told once Ernesto, wait a minute, look at me, old European fascist. Don't you know what is anti-Semitism? It's easy to bring them together. A true anti-Semite would instantly answer, you see, that's why Jews are dangerous. They are really evil, but they mask this through their kind appearance, you know. That's the magic of anti-Semitism is that all the facts are reinterpreted as showing their opposite. But I want to say, sorry, very briefly, another thing about this ostranenie, rendering strange. I think, nonetheless, we should not confuse two things. One is ostranenie, and here I see the danger of Trump. It's more that ostranenie, sorry, this estrangement, in the sense that things that were unthinkable 10 years ago, to be openly racist, to advocate torture and so on, are now all of a sudden acceptable. They no longer even surprise us. That's the tragic sign of regression for me. Trump is for me not only economic, political, but even not even moral, a catastrophe at the level of public decency.
So do you regret having seemed to have supported him over Hillary
No,
Clinton?
no,
You
absolutely.
Don't? Why not?
Because I will tell you why.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
my very simple party line. I think that we should never forget, and I may be wrong, I'm not dogmatically clinging to it, that Trump's success is a symptom, not in any deep psychoanalytic sense, the result of the failure of the liberal center and left. And if we don't address that problem, of this leftist hegemony which is failing not only in the United States, but also in Europe and so on, we will not get rid of Trump. So the crucial task for me is to change something in this left liberal field, to move it maybe a little bit more to, should it even call it left? I have the same doubts as you about left, right, and so on. Otherwise, Trump will just return. That's not the key point. So my crazy hope was that it's maybe worth to take the risk, Trump, to mobilize, to bring something like more Bernie Sanders, whatever, and so on and so on. This is why the truly dangerous person today for me, for example, is Nancy Pelosi. Because she is precisely renormalizing the situation. She made recently an interview where she said, don't worry, we had Reagan for 8 years, we had Bush, we will have Trump, things go normal, and so on. No, Trump is really a catastrophe.
Slavoj, can I pick up the term symptom that you brought up?
Yeah.
Because I think, this is from the sublime object of ideology. So we come back a few years, a couple of decades back. If the symptom is something that we can kind of borrow from psychoanalysis, but originally you trace it quite beautifully back to Marx.
Lacan says this.
Lacan says Marx kind of brings up the idea of symptom as the kind of excess of ideology. So would it be possible to bring this into architecture in the following way, that let's say buildings are a sort of symptom of ideology, that they are exactly at the intersection of capitalist desire, and also they produce a kind of let's say a problem, but also a visualization of authorship. How do we see these? How do we understand buildings as symptoms of both capitalism and authorship, as a kind of
if I may
dichotomy
add
between
a brief improvisation to provoke you, then you should take over. Can I just add something to that Ostranenie estrangement stuff? That would be this simple ideological regression. But I think we should not confuse this, like what in the way Trump estranged us from old liberal certainty, with another, like here. It may surprise you, but although I know you don't agree with her. For example, the way Jane Bennett describes that famous trash site with all the interacting, that's for me the true productive estrangement, something that you consider simply an affair of human desires when you posit humans as interacting with biological processes, organic, inorganic. You get a certain inhuman view of the situation. And that fascinates me absolutely. So it's more complex. But to go back to symptom, I prefer not to use this term too much because in psychoanalysis it has a very precise meaning. It's especially, symptom is never just a symptom. Lacan plays with this term symptom like a knot. Symptom is really what holds the subject together. If you dissolve the symptom, it's not you get the truth. Usually you get a psychotic breakdown and so on. Symptom is precisely not just a symptom in the sense of a sign of some real thing going on. For example, to refer to...
Can you relate it to
what
can you relate it to authorship? I mean, can you relate it to authorship? Let's say all buildings by Frank Gehry are symptoms of his, author function.
Why I would prefer even not to use the term symptom. If we go to, and my God, I talk too much, you should counterattack. You know what fascinates me in architecture? It was already quoted today. In what sense, at least a certain, maybe I'm universalizing it too much, modern architecture, all these great projects, Corbusier and so on, it's clear that they not only react to certain social problems, antagonisms, but they propose, for example, the new urban design and so on, separating place to sleep, place to work, place to have fun, as a solution to these problems. And second, this is why my arch enemy, if you ask me, and here Frank Gehry is not totally innocent, are, I think, one thing to bomb today are these public performative venues. The idea is operas, concert halls shouldn't be just elitist operas. You should have their amusement parks, cafeterias, open public space. It's pure absolute lie. These are open spaces which are themselves isolated under the cupola and so on. But another thing, so in this sense, you cannot understand architecture, and I'm not saying the ultimate truth about architecture here. You can argue in a more formalist way, but what fascinated me, another thing, about, for example, this is my true love, I must admit it, the classical Stalinist architecture, wedding cake, and so on. You know what fascinated me there so much? Something that in ideology you were absolutely prohibited to say, that Soviet Union claimed to be an egalitarian worker state. It was in reality an extremely almost neo-feudal hierarchic state. You just look at the buildings and you see it. And this is the beautiful paradox. It's not as a kind of a dissident act. You had to do it like this. It was like if you wanted to undermine Stalinism, you needn't to go, you just looked at the building, Stalinist official building, and you see the lie of official ideology. It confirms this idea to me, deep Freudian idea that you cannot totally lie. Truth is somehow always articulated.
What do we say about the same exact place, maybe only 15 years earlier, having a kind of formalist moment of abstraction, and then somehow killing it? And I think this is something that we can relate a little bit to today.
I know what you mean.
I think we can relate it to today, because if Hutemas closes in the 20s, if Bauhaus closes in the 30s, if we're now entering a difficult time period, we're not quite sure where we are chronologically. Yeah. The question, on the one hand, is what are we to do? We're here in a
an architectural question or a general?
I think it's an institutional question of knowledge. So let's say it's an architecture question on the one hand, but it can be broader than that. What are we to do as those who produce knowledge? Have we entered the 21st century? Are we repeating the 20th? Here at SCI-Arc, I guess, well,
I think we are, but my God, I talk too much.
But
you
Graham,
want to do it.
Graham, I'm curious to hear from you, because
you is both of us.
I'm curious to hear from Graham first.
Yes.
Can I answer first the question about buildings as symptoms of capitalism or neoliberalism, which people like to say?
Because this is a flat, abstract statement.
Exactly.
I don't think you learn a lot.
You don't. And what I'm worried about is that usually that statement is a way of gaining the moral high ground in a debate.
Yes,
so then you can talk down to everyone. And so O says all objects are equal, and Alexander Galloway writes an article saying we think humans are garbage because we're the equal of garbage. I mean, come on. There's no intellectual content in that claim. He's simply trying to look down on us from above. And this is what I worry about.
That's the problem, sorry, with political correctness.
Yes, that's right.
For me.
That's right.
The more white people who act politically correct, the more they apparently humiliate themselves. The more they gain in this pleasure of. But by humiliating ourselves, by assuming guilt for everything, we assume the high moral ground and so on.
Slava, I'm cutting you off for 1 minute. Graham.
1 minute?
5 minutes.
No, 1 minute's fine.
Let's make a deal, 3.5.
So yes, there's obviously a sense in which buildings can be read as symptoms of whatever period they're in, but I'm not sure that's the right move to make right now. I think we need a formalist move at the moment, as unfashionable as it is. We need to look at the building as cut off from its surroundings, just like we need to do with the artwork, but without the drawback of the earlier formalism, which is that it tried to exclude anything outside the work itself. That isn't always the case. Sometimes the work does let other influences permeate. And so in art criticism, for example, you had Clement Greenberg's formalism, which I have some sympathies with, but he ends up too much against performance art, conceptual art, installations, these things. But you can have those things and still have it be an autonomous formal unit. So you can have performers.
What do you mean exactly by formalism?
I suppose the way you could define formalism is that a thing is autonomous from its surroundings. That'd be the first step. I think in modernity, it also takes on a second meaning, which I don't like, which is the cutting off of the subject from the object. So in Kant's aesthetics, for example, aesthetics is all going on here. It's not going on out there. And then in Fried and Greenberg, I think it reverses. It's all out there. It's not here. And that's why Fried hates theatrical aesthetics. Anything theatrical is bad. And in formal ethics, of course, in Kant, I think it's the only place he uses the term formalism, is in his ethics, not in the other parts. And formalism in ethics, of course, is the idea that it has nothing to do with the consequences or the content of the act. It has to do with following the pure formula of duty. And I think we would do well to get over that. I mean, the most powerful critique of Kant's ethics still was probably Max Scheler's. I know you like Hegel's, but Max Scheler's critique is that an ethics has to do with our love for something that we're passionate about, something that we are drawn to, and that we make a major topic of our lives. And So in a sense, the basic ethical unit is not us. The basic ethical unit is us plus what we love. This would be Shaler's position. And I tried to show this through a reading of Dante in my last book. This is what Dante is about as well. Dante is about an ethics of love. It's about your attachment to things. And what's the lowest sin in Dante? It's fraud, which is a false attachment. It's pretending to be attached to something that you're not, such as family or country or friends that you then betray.
So it's Trump, no?
Trump?
Would be the sinner for.
Where would you put Trump in the...
But isn't he a fraud exactly in this sense? He pretends America first and so on.
He's a fraud in almost every sense. But
yeah.
and what really, maybe I'll go off topic here, but I really need to say this to get it out of my system. We've known this guy for 30-some years, and we knew what a clown he is, and yet we elect him anyway after all this time. And I could see the American public going through a phase of thinking we need a businessman to fix everything. We had Perot in the early 90s. There was this kind of phenomenon. But he's not even a good businessman. He's made his business out of cheating people, out of shafting contractors and employees.
He seems to be a real estate developer, so maybe we...
Yeah, but I agree with you.
Maybe we can... how do you feel about opening it up to the audience?
But listen, what he was doing was going from one bankruptcy to another.
Exactly.
And somehow making the taxpayers pay for his debts and squeezing out. Right. He's not what he pretends to be, a successful individual, big capitalist, and so on and so on.
And unlike you, I'm not optimistic that something good will come of this. I think so much damage could be done that there's not going to be a chance to do anything better. I think we're losing too many basic things, and that's why I went for Hillary, despite maybe her not being my first choice.
Hillary, for me, is such a tragedy. Okay.
But could have preserved some things.
Maybe. Let's draw. Right. No, but sorry, just what you mentioned about, what were you talking about just before this?
Symptoms. Capitalist symptoms.
Yeah, formalism and so on.
Yes.
But you know, I try to be also a formalist. I think all good Marxists are formalists in the sense that you don't project some social antagonism onto it. I think that, for example, that's how, at my best, which is not always the case, I dismiss many of my cinema analysis as just, I use brutally examples to make a theoretical point, nothing to do with films. But sometimes when I write about Tarkovsky, about Hitchcock and so on, I try to be a formalist. I think that to get even at social context of Hitchcock, for example, for me, the supreme scene, the second murder of Detective Arbogast in Psycho, the way camera moves up and so on, you have an entire implicit theology and so on there. I think that for me, formalism and social analysis do not exclude themselves. Social analysis does not mean immediate content analysis, is the bourgeois a hero or whatever. And even with architecture, my God, you should like, Psycho is for me one of the great works about architecture, because the basic tension of the film is precisely horizontal, vertical. Mother's house, modeled on Edward, I think it was on Hopper or what, that Mother's house, and all those motels against, it's against two types of traditional Mother's house and modern flat motel, Bates Motel. So ironically, in my analysis of Psycho, I ask myself, because the whole tension of Norman Bates is, he's literally a guy caught between the two. Traditional architecture, Mother's house, and modern motel. But what if, because this is still a modernist opposition, what if we move into what, in popular terms, is called postmodernism, and imagine a motel which is itself flat but done with all the traditional kitsch ornaments, that you don't need Mother's house up there. Mother house would be put as a mask on the motel itself. What would happen in that case with Norman Bates? You know, I rather don't think about it. Right. You know. So just to avoid this, I deeply sympathize with your idea of formalism. That I am absolutely opposed to this vulgar reading of projecting some social content and so on and so on. All but great artists formalists.
I think your analysis of Tarkovsky, the slowing down of the frame, completely slowing down to beyond, it's a kind of slowing down of reality, which becomes its own mode of abstraction. That to me
that's a beautiful reading. I agree with you. We talked before that.
I would like to open it up. Is it okay if we open it up to the audience? Maybe.
No, can I just add another thing?
Is there a microphone?
Very briefly.
No?
The way I would have answered you when you said reality and so on would be nonetheless, maybe this is our misunderstanding. Reality is constructed in the simple sense that what we perceive as social reality is different from one society, but I'm not a social constructivist. There is the real, there are traumas and so on. So my ultimate enemy even is this cheap deconstructionism, like everything is socially constructed.
Yeah.
We share this.
Except that the real is not reality and the objet is not my object. So we still have those differences.
Well, I will put it in this way to end up in a comical way. Leave this to the KGB unit that will investigate you to say what is your object. The party will look into it and inform you about it. Sorry, let's go. But you get the point how the two of us, we may appear totally opposed. And that's what I found. And all of a sudden, there are these unexpected interconnections and so on, which is why I agree with him precisely where he doesn't even agree with his own guys, like how you criticize Latour and all those relationists and insist on fixity, identity. That's absolutely crucial for me. And here you are, although you would kill me for saying this, a good Hegelian, as good readers of Hegel, like the French Gérard Lebrun demonstrated. Hegel is absolutely not this kind of universal mobilist. Everything develops and so on and so on. Okay, stop.
But I still like the thing in itself, and you don't. That's a big difference.
I do, but I would redefine it as thing in itself, as you said, my God. It's not simply out there. It's in the cracks here and so on. You said this. You provided a wonderful formulation. Why also you are totally right, criticized Meillassoux. We don't arrive and think in itself by, you provided by abstracting and then trying how are things independently. I totally agree with you that the problem is that we are part of the thing itself. We are not here and thing itself is out there.
Are you talking about a kind of death of abstraction? I mean, is this...
No, we are all for abstraction. No,
abstraction.
And for me, as a Hegelian, again, abstraction is part of reality. Abstraction is not you move out of reality. That's the whole paradox. Reality can be abstract.
Then I stay on stage. Okay.
Sorry?
Then I will stay on stage.
Let it be. For some time, Central Committee allows you to... Now, you know, this is Stalinist opportunism. You are left-wing deviation, you are right-wing deviation, and I'm the party line making tactical alliances with Bukharin, with Trotsky.
Filling the bureaucracy.
Yeah, bureaucracy. Sorry, let's go on. But I cut you off. I still, you think, have some final thought.
That I'm still more willing to do. I do think the thing in itself is out there. I just don't think it's knowable. So we do still disagree on that.
Yes, but again, the problem for me is that precisely as such, for example, let's take communism. At what level is for you communism a thing in itself?
The fact that communism is not completely actualized in any of its effects, or in,
I agree.
Or in any of the components that build it up.
But isn't it that it is a thing in itself, but as such, it is in some sense the effect of people interacting?
Sure, every object is.
And then we agree, but go to but.
The but is that the object is emergent. It isn't reducible to those pieces. It has,
absolutely agree.
So we agree about that.
As a good Hegelian, I absolutely agree. No, that's what Hegel calls idea. For Hegel, idea is not something, it's not a Platonic idea out there. And that's what Hegel makes it clear. I agree with you here. Nonetheless, we cannot simply say it's just a fetishized effect. All that really exists are human people, actual people. All this, I really dislike it, early Marx metaphorics of the only actual things are real people producing. No, in itself, although it doesn't exist as this concrete object, it also exists, it exerts causality, efficiency. I totally agree with you here. You wanted to say something?
I'm done.
We are so merciful, we even allow... No, sorry, but didn't you want to play democracy?
Didn't we do it? Did we not do this?
No, by democracy, I mean...
Yes. Does anybody want to ask a question? Yeah. I think there must be a microphone somewhere.
I already criticized her before that she didn't organize it in a proper communist way, free debate, but you must distribute the questions in advance to prevent fascist provocations.
Yes.
All right, I know Graham. We met in New York a while back, and I've been to Žižek's lecture quite a few times. But here, I think we need to clarify what is at stake in this conversation between two philosophers. The audience is primarily architects. So I've been reading on speculative realism in Miyasu for quite some time, and the basic moral, if you can call it moral, is that we're working towards an alien ontology of architecture, such that architecture, since its inception, except with the Babylonian and the Greeks, is a massive project of humanity. So that architecture is man written large, so to speak, and we project our image onto the landscape, such that that kind of a man-subject world, relationship between man and world, is such a correlation structure that we cannot sever it. So then you have Miyasu with to break up the correlation structure. And then you have Graham, that break up such that's so radical that the object in itself, which is can't think in itself, is unknowable. And this is just your assertion, because modern science tells us that objects have varying degrees of knowability, accessibility. So it's not that we're completely voluntarily asserting ignorance, so to speak. Now, in that, this is a very complex structure. So the two characters that I've managed to synthesize is Kant, notion of synthetic a priori judgment, out of which the transcendental imagination springs forth. And according to Catherine Malebranche's assessment is that the difference between Hegel and Heidegger is that Hegel manages to Christianize Kant's notion of the transcendental, but in the case of Heidegger, he re-injected temporality from a phenomenological standpoint. So there's no temporality, even though there's an end of history in Hegel, but you don't have that kind of a gross, overarching metaphysics of time in Heidegger. So you insert temporality so that there's a time past, time present, and time future, and then you reinsert finitude as opposed to infinite of the absolute in Hegel. Now, okay, that's first connection. The second connection is through Leibniz. And Leibniz is a grossly underestimated philosopher, so that we completely missed out on Leibniz, because he was the first person who came up with the concept of computation. So the reason I'm mentioning is this, that we need a computational ontology of architecture, such that computation has its own object in itself. So we don't have that kind of linkages, because the modern notion of computation, for architects, we use computation from representational notion of computation as opposed to non-representational use of computation. So we have to go to a non-representational use of computation. And if you look at cellular automata, right, one-dimensional cellular automata has 256 rule sets, and those rule sets are autonomous. And that is the equivalent, the formal axiomatic equivalent of the thing in itself. So if you instantiate that Turing machine with the one-dimensional automata, the machine behaves on its own being. So you no longer need architecture. Yeah. So we need that kind of a synthesis of Leibniz, the transcendental subjectivity, with the formalism of the synthesis of formalism of Leibniz, metaphysics of Leibniz, with the Hegelian synthetic a priori. Because right now,
you begin.
My knowledge of your background is that you're very sympathetic to Miyasu's position.
Specifically about you.
About you, okay. I'm not sure what you think the merit of computational architecture would be in terms of getting at the thing in itself. I can see other merits. I can see procedural merits in having all this parametric software and things like this. But in what sense is computational architecture going to get us at the thing itself? That's what I don't get. Because I don't agree with this mathematical line about you and Miyasu.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how.
So that's an ideological assumption. See, what I'm saying is that if you take one-dimensional cellular automata, that is an object in itself. It's not our invention.
A cellular automaton?
Cellular automata, yes.
Okay, maybe.
No,
but
it's not maybe. It's as simple as that.
I think it's too reductive, but I think we should move on because it sounds like you have a wider architectural
If you don't accept
program.
the computational ontology, then you're going to move. See, this has to do with the subject and object. So computation can't even do it.
I'm not sure I followed that, but Maybe we should talk about this later. Maybe we should, if somebody has a short question, it might be easier to deal with.
Can I just briefly make a short point?
Sure.
As always, in defense of Hegel, it's for me, if I understood you correctly, way too simple to dismiss Hegel as reducing temporality and so on and so on. First, what Hegel calls absolute vision, absolute knowing, has nothing to do with now it's the end of history, I know everything. Right. Hegel, it's so interesting to, for example, Hegel's philosophy of right is often misread, that corporate vision of state developed there, as if he's presenting the ultimate model of how society should be. But how can we forget what Hegel says in the famous foreword to Philosophy of Right, where he says, the owl of Minerva takes off in the ear, which means, he says, when we can bring to conceptualize a certain social order, it means its time has passed, it's over. Was Hegel really such an idiot that he didn't know that the same must held for his own philosophy of right? So he's not describing a kind of ideal corporate model. He's describing something that is already disappearing. And going on, Hegel is much more open. Read his philosophy of history. He was not an empirical idiot. In his philosophy of history, in the introduction, apropos, it's not bad if you consider it was not written but recorded, registered by his pupils. 1820, when he approaches United States and Russia, he says it's too early to say what these countries are spiritually. Theirs will be the next century. No, it's not so stupid. So what I mean is that what Hegel calls absolute knowing is a kind of a limit.
I don't need a mic. Graham, I just want to
Sorry, yes.
a question. I have an opportunity tomorrow. I would like to paraphrase briefly Carl's question, because I think it was an important question and maybe got missed. He wasn't asking you about digital architecture. He was stating the proposition of a digital ontology, which begins in Turing and has gone all the way today till Ted Mark. So their argument is that computational methods are an adequate ontology for all actions of matter. You in your book also acknowledge that that is a position that you do not subscribe to. His argument about representation is when you speak of objects and things, to a computational ontologist, you're looking at representations of a computational ontology. So he's simply asking you to address the issue that you mention in your book, but you don't actually unfold.
Which book was this?
In Immaterialism, you mention a philosopher and several people that are working in the new materialism that would like to use physics and science as a reductive ontology, and one version of that is computational methods. For example, Turing's argument that all mathematical behavior can be made, can be worked out through Turing's method. And now we think, and most scientists, Tegmark is the one most recently who argued that there is no process in the universe that cannot be mathematically described, meaning every material process, whether animate or inanimate, can be mathematically in principle described. That constitutes a fundamental ontology. If that is a fundamental ontology and a flat ontology, it also connects bodies to glasses. But if you talk about bodies and glasses, you're talking about representations of that ontology. And all Carl is asking you is what's your position on that?
It wouldn't be a flat ontology, for one thing, because then you'd be saying that the lowest level is the real level and everything else is simply made up out of these computations.
I was paraphrasing his question. I don't actually agree with it.
No. So that would be what I call undermining, where you're simply trying to go to the smallest level, the most basic level, and using that to explain everything else. And one of the problems with that is it does not explain what we call emergence, and meaning that certain qualities and certain properties appear at levels above the most basic one. And it's not really so much a question of whether the higher level properties can be predicted, because in a lot of cases they can. A lot of times you bring two people together, you know exactly what's going to happen. It doesn't matter. The fact that what happens is different from the two individuals. Marriage, you might know exactly this marriage is going to be a disaster. Those two people never should have gotten married. the fact that you were right about it doesn't change the fact that the marriage is different than either of the individuals. And a flat ontology would have to include a reference to all those different scales of individuals, not just cellular automata, not just mathematical descriptions. And even if it's true that you could do a mathematical description of everything in the universe, you could also do a description in language of everything in the universe. It doesn't mean everything's just language. So the universal applicability of a method does not mean that you can do an ontology that exhausts everything in that way. That's why.
I didn't say exhausted, but then yes, you don't have principle sufficient. I mean, he completely wholesale reject.
No, I got your question answered.
But what is right? So he rejected the principle sufficient reason, came up with those hyper chaos. But recently, if you look at Google's translation engine, they invented their own language, internal language around machines that we don't even know what they're talking about. And that pertains to Leibniz's notion of internal principle of the monads. And those are objects in itself. We don't know what they are, but these are not the we didn't invent them. By the way,
there it goes.
Can I maybe add something here, maybe
Sure.
to help you? You know, going to Badiou,
yeah.
and I know Badiou very well, my God, we are friends.
Yeah.
I don't think he would agree with your description. The key feature of his mathematical ontology, the idea is mathematics-based ontology, is that this ontology is not a kind of a Turing-style flat description. It is inconsistent, necessarily inconsistent, full of gaps and so on. And there he sees the opening. In spite of this, my very friendly critique of Badiou would have been that, okay, he has this ontology of mathematics, multiplicity of multiplicities, and then I don't think, and he has basically three levels. This pure ontology, then he has his phenomenology, which means the world, and then he has the event. Mm-hmm. How does a world emerge of this pure mathematical ontology? How does an event explode in a world? I don't think he has a good theory. That's why, incidentally, being aware of this problem, he's always writing another book. Now he's writing the third book. So again, I think that
Carl, maybe we can invite you to dinner and you can join us.
What I'm just
Event is a great book. Everyone should buy.
Sorry?
I love Event. Your book about
So
how
which book?
everything is a sequence of events and everything's sort of a catastrophe. My question for you.
Who is you?
Sort of short. My name's Elliot Rose.
No, not
oh,
who
who's
is
you?
you?
I'm
Who
Elliot
is
Rose.
you?
You're Slavoj
Him or-
Žižek.
Yeah, me, yeah.
You.
No.
Yeah. So you describe in the parallax view Lenin's sort of attraction to abstract art, sort of unrelated. I was wondering if you see any sort of similar attractions from today's leader into something sort of that seems unrelated, because you describe it as there's no relation between these fascist abstract art makers and Lenin's political views, but in a way they're both.
Why fascist? Sorry, why fascist?
I believe that's how it was. I believe that's how you wrote it. I think it was like they were part of supporters of fascist regimes, or not, if not supporters, members, or etc. But
This was about the torture chambers at the beginning of Parallax.
yeah, that was a great. I love that.
Oh, but that was okay.
But the question is, that seems. I've been talking with people about it, and they say, well, the similarity where it comes together is revolution. So they sort of revolt in art. He sort of revolts in politics. So there is sort of, even if not immediately apparent, there is a connecting factor. So I was wondering maybe if you see any parallaxes in today's leaders with similar sort of stuff.
I see. No, what fascinated me at that point, that it's so popular, that was the avant-garde dream. What Bolsheviks did in politics, we are doing in art. But what fascinates me is how nonetheless these two levels, for some structural reason, cannot ever come together. In the sense that you will never get a politician who would, I think it's a deep necessity that all big Bolshevik leaders were, in their art tastes, pretty traditional and so on. So this is what interests me, how I agree that they are in some way parallel, but nonetheless they cannot come together. The illusion of constructivists and so on was that they will come together. They will basically, it's a very vicious reading, expecting the Bolshevik state to recognize them, like we are in art what you are doing in politics. And although Bolsheviks were pretty progressive here, for example, people don't take this into account. Did you see the disgusting movie Dangerous Method? Keira Knightley as that Sabine Spielrein or who, the patient of Jung who turned to Freud. Yeah. But the movie stops at the crucial moment. You know what happens with her afterwards? She moved to Soviet Union. She established in early 20s the first psychoanalytic Freudian kindergarten. Where? In Kremlin. You know that it's, okay, I don't want to get it. So what fascinates me in this that sometimes phenomena which move at which are really the same tendency in a different level in politics, in art, for this very reason cannot connect in reality, has to remain disparate. Here also we should be very brutal. I wonder if you would agree and reread Stalin's imposition of socialist realism. It wasn't, there was striving multiplicity in the 20s, and then brutal Stalin came, imposed socialist realism. In all histories that I've read, Stalin's introduction of socialist realism was an extremely popular move. Because ordinary people were sick and...
Popular for whom? I mean...
For ordinary people who were sick and tired of... I am for them, but of those... Are we aware how unpopular among broad population futurists, constructivists were, and so on and so on? Do you know that Eisenstein's, those late movies, October, The Old and the New, they were a total fiasco. They played for 2 weeks in a suburban movie, movie theater in Moscow. So what Stalin offered to people...
Wasn't Eisenstein Potemkin completely enacted by the people? Or at least
no, it was the other way around. I know what you are referring to. When they were celebrating, I don't know which anniversary of the revolution.
And they paraded the third international
you are
model.
Probably referring to that famous where all of them participated, all the artists, how is called the one, Black Square, my God, Black Square. Malevich and so on, that big reenactment of revolution in 1920-21. But already Potemkin, I read analysis here. It was a hit abroad, my God, Soviet cinema. It wasn't a big success in Soviet Union itself. What they liked there was Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and so on.
I don't think they had very many cinemas to actually watch any
it's
of
a
this
miracle.
film, right?
They did in the 20s. There was a free import of films. My God, I saw Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford visited the Soviet Union. It was thousands of people gathering them and so on and so on.
But the question, I think, also has to do with moving into the 30s where Shklovsky, whose brother was sent to the Gulag in order to bring him up into the construction sites of the canals, along with Rodchenko, who then produced the propaganda machine for USSR in construction, which becomes a kind of Western version of this socialist realism, where they actually produce rendered photography as a kind of vehicle for bringing
I agree with you. It was a tragedy, horror, the way Stalin crushed avant-garde. I just think we should see the 20s in a much more problematic way. They were not a lost paradise. For example, I've written about it, and Boris Groys edited the documents with Zurkamp, 2 times 1,000 book on. You know what was almost the predominant popular view, not among ordinary people, but among the intellectual elite in the 20s? A kind of Soviet version of tech Gnosticism. They did it the first, what Ray Kurzweil and others are doing it today. Trotsky even was part of it. I quote it somewhere. Trotsky wrote in 25, the big test of communism is not just destroying capitalism and so on. We should move forward and create a new man. And he means it literally, in the biological sense. Homo sapiens, we should say, goodbye Homo sapiens, you did his work, you are too primitive and so on. And they had a very precise metaphysical vision. They claimed that sexuality is the enemy, the ultimate enemy, because now we conquered political power, economic power, but sexuality is still too spontaneous. So their idea is this one, a very precise one, that our feelings, sentiments, should work like in a machine, how do you call it, where you read what is the temperature and so on.
Thermometer.
Sorry?
Thermometer.
Yeah, that we should acquire this distance towards reality, that, you know, you don't feel heat, fear, pleasure. You just register it, and then you regulate your life and so on. It was all this idea, which is, I found wonderful predecessors to this idea. My favorite Cartesian philosopher, Malebranche. He had this idea that for him, the original position of Adam was like this. Before the fall, Adam had this type of distance. And he says clearly, they were having sex like crazy in paradise. But it was totally mechanic sex. For Adam, raising his penis was exactly the same as raising his hand. He did it as hard work. Then comes fall. You know what is fall? Fall happens when you lose this distance and are immediately affected by reality. And the origin of the fall for Malebranche is naked Eve. When Adam saw naked Eve, he made an epistemological mistake. He thought, oh, now I'm in direct contact with objects. And then he gets a wonderful theological idea that God punished man because Adam and said, okay, you think you will be like me, a master? I will punish you so that I will make it so that part of your body will be uncontrollable by you. And you have a long theory in Augustine on this, how the true punishment for sin is erection. You know, you cannot control it. It happens when you don't want it, when you want it, it doesn't happen, and so on. So it's and all this re-emerged surprisingly in the. This is the most interesting phenomenon of the 20s, I think. And they were all in it. Even Trotsky was tempted by it. It goes as my gratitude to Lenin that he never fell for it. Bogdanov, great Lenin's opponent, was into it. This idea of creating immortality, we should all move to a higher level of existence, and so on and so on. So all I'm just saying is the 20s are not just the simple avant-garde phenomenon. Very weird things happened in the 20s.
Yeah. I think,
What?
Are we done?
Yeah, but there is another typical of you. Look,
there are many questions.
No. You were a centrist, but you ignored the left and the right.
Okay. Daniel.
Yeah, but there is also
then I don't know you, but you.
Hi, I'm Daniel. So I'm not really a philosophy expert, so I apologize if this comes across a little naive. But Graham, you specifically talked about the idea of buildings as symptoms, and talked about how we need to take a more formalist approach that makes it more of a closed system, and to do the same with art. And again, I'm not a philosophy expert, but in my undergrad, I read some David Hume, and he talks in his writings on imagination that any process of creativity is essentially taking from like quotidian experience and either augmenting, compounding, dividing, or multiplying, whatever. So I just want to open up the question of whether or not either of you agrees or disagrees with this idea that David Hume has about creativity, and if you do agree, if it's possible at all to actually produce anything, buildings, art, or anything in a completely closed system. So.
Hume. David Hume.
Well, you can't build it in a completely closed system, but that doesn't mean it can't be a closed system by the end. So, for example, my body is made of all kinds of subatomic stuff and cells and veins and things. It doesn't follow that my body is just a collection of all those things assembled together. There's something more. The way they're arranged, this body has more to it than all those individual parts. And I would say, yeah, I don't believe we're born with innate ideas about how to create art. I think we have to draw from our experience. It doesn't follow that an artwork simply dissolves into its surroundings, its social, political, environmental surroundings. There's a point at which a creation is cut off from its environment. In the crudest sense, all authors and all artists die someday. Their works are left behind, and the works can be understood in different cultures. They can be understood from different standpoints. And so there's a certain innate formalism at work in any object. And where I would disagree with the classical formalists in various fields is simply, as I already said about Kant, that Kant tries to separate the subject and the object in all of his formalism, so that there's ethics is all here, art is all here, ontology is all here. You can have a formal thing that's made of a human, non-human compound, right? So like in ethics, the human mind is not necessarily the unit of ethics. I think the unit of ethics is the human mind plus something that it takes seriously. In the arts, I happen to think that there is no art without a beholder. Even though Fried thinks that if an artwork exists only for a beholder, then it's too theatrical. I think theater is of the essence of art, and of architecture, by the way. I think that there needs to be a person there appreciating it, or it's not a work. I don't think after nuclear holocaust there's any art or architecture left. And so in that sense, the works close off, but they might close off with an observer, or they might close off with a socio-political effect in some cases, like Guernica or Uncle Tom's Cabin, or other works that are impossible to understand without the events that gave rise to them.
But you know what? Would you go as far here? I support you. You know also in what sense? Historicists like to say to understand a great work of art, you have to know the entire historical context. Right. I claim no, exactly the opposite. A great, truly great work of art is the one which, precisely can be understood and sometimes works even better when torn out of its context and retroactively. Look, I think here I'm a radical, idealist if you want. It's wrong to say to understand Shakespeare you have to know Elizabethan England. No, to understand today Elizabethan England you have to read Shakespeare.
That's
if you directly were to find yourself, for example, even some friends from Iran told me, don't just go to Iran and look around. You will understand nothing. Look some good movies and so on. And that's for me, although this is very traditional to say, the miracle of Shakespeare. How he survives this metamorphosis. And it's not just there is an original Shakespeare, what he really meant. I don't care what he really meant. It's wonderful how each epoch reinvents Shakespeare. And that's for me the true miracle to keep it alive. Look, that's why I'm a Wagnerian. He may be a very bad guy, vulgar anti-Semite. But isn't it wonderful that today, great stagings of Wagner are almost an exclusive domain of left-wing Jewish directors, you know. Wagner was, this is the great ideological triumph. Wagner was totally reappropriated by Jewish progressives and so on. Here I see your notion of in itself. It's wrong to be a historicist and say, but Wagner didn't mean this. He didn't produce a finished work. What later interpretations are not just later interpretation. They affect the in itself, the identity of the very work of art. And that's the only true historical approach, not the cheap historicism. You have to look at the... This is why, sorry, just to finish, in my crazy idealism, you wouldn't go so far, I love what Hegel writes about Peloponnesian Wars. A crazy... He says that the spiritual result of Peloponnesian Wars was Thucydides' book about them. Like, to put it in vulgar terms, wonderful ideal, that real war had to be fought so that in order to enable a book being written about it. And in some spiritual sense, this is true. The objective function, now we can say retroactively, of Elizabethan England was to enable Shakespeare to write his plays. And I was once in San Francisco, and I humiliated them. They started to shout people. I said, you know that in the same way, the only reason for your stupid city, San Francisco, to exist was to enable Hitchcock to shoot Vertigo there, you know, and so on. I mean, of course, this is nonsense at the material causal level. But in some spiritual sense of spiritual inheritance, it is true. Elizabeth is the one who lived in the period of Shakespeare and so on.
We promised one question from the right, so maybe this is the final question.
That's where your heart is.
Young lady.
Who?
Yes.
Make a choice, the lady or the man?
The lady.
Okay.
Next to the column.
Hi, Graham, this question is directed at you. You said that reality is a more important word than truth, and that truth is out there, but it is unknowable, which I agree with. But I have a nagging thought that this attitude is exemplary of the position that the left is so guilty of taking, the position of taking a higher moral ground. And so can you speak to how this attitude, how you see it functioning in the project of renewing the left, the project of the left, or whatever you might want to call it?
But is this your project at all to renew the left?
It's not, but
she agrees with him, but she wants your politics.
Actually, maybe I should first say this. I cherish many of the goals of the left, but I would never call myself a leftist. And
why not? Exactly.
I was going to say why.
Yeah.
2 reasons. There are 2 things for me that are crucial to political theory, and I think the left misses both of them. One of them for me is that there is no political knowledge, right? And on the left, you have this idea that we know what the diagnosis is from a Marxist standpoint, a Rousseauian standpoint. I don't think we have any political knowledge. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think non-human actors are a very important part of politics, and the left tends to be very humanist, very, very human-centered. I know Marx gives a lot of analyses of factories and things, but I think we need to start bringing non-human actors into politics. And also, I think we need to be willing to be more surprised than the left is often willing to be. I had a nice discussion with the late Mark Fisher about this. Mark Fisher took your line that we've had a total failure of imagination. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Yeah. But my answer to that is Frederick Jameson really more imaginative than Steve Jobs? I'm not sure that he is, right? That in some cases, the left keeps recycling the same discourse and the same complaints about everything. Sometimes the imagination comes from elsewhere, from what the left denounces. A complaint about your friend Badiou. All of the events that he counts as political events, none of them are going to surprise Badiou because they're all based on the communist invariant, as he says. Nothing's going to happen that makes Badiou say, oh, maybe I was wrong, maybe the left is wrong here or there. Right? It's going to be, communism is going to prevail in every one of his events. Whereas in the other events, he's more open-minded, right? You're not sure what the next scientific event is going to be, or the next amorous event, or the next artistic event. So I worry that there's this idea that we already know what the truth is. And I don't think we have any idea what the best political system is going to be. This is what Foucault said to Chomsky, by the way, in their famous debates. Chomsky said the best social system would be this, and Foucault kind of ironically said, I'm not as advanced as Chomsky. I have no idea what the best political system is. And I'm with Foucault on that point. I don't know. But I think renewing politics in general means coming into contact with reality. And so I think the coming politics probably has to be based in some way on the climate issues, as well as the refugee issues. So to that extent, I agree with Latour that you need to not be an escapist. You need to face up to what the problems are. And some of those problems may lead to solutions that you might have previously rejected. Maybe, for example, we should stop whining about capitalism only all the time, or neoliberalism as people call it now. Maybe there are some things from capitalism that we're going to need to preserve and that can be beneficial in ways that we didn't foresee. So I'd like to approach politics with not radical openness, because I hate that phrase, but radical attentiveness to reality. And I think what we have here is we have a president with no sense of reality whatsoever. If anything characterizes him, it's not just that he's beyond truth, because politicians have always lied, right? It's that this one seems to have no sense of reality whatsoever. I don't even think I think he believes half to 3/4 of what he says, even when it's easily contradicted by video footage or polls. I think we have somebody who has radically lived his life not in contact with reality, and his wealthy upbringing and all these other factors have enabled that to happen. And it's very dangerous for all of us.
I tend to, surprisingly, if I may just add a little bit, I agree with you, but first, I agree with you that all that knowledge of the future in politics, the unfortunate some Marxist metaphor of riding the train towards the future and so on. No, but you have another left. For example, recently I was rereading some people hate him as a proto-totalitarian Saint-Just. And he uses a wonderful metaphor. He said, we in the French Revolution, we are as if on a ship in a wild storm entering an uncharted territory. We don't know where we are going. I mean, he was extremely open here. On the other hand, I agree with much that you said, I agree with you, the left has to admit this. That was when I was talking with people on Occupy Wall Street. I was just asking them, but what do you want? What's your project? They didn't have an idea. So we have to admit this. We don't have an idea. Even people who are critical of capitalism, what do they want? It's just what I ironically refer to as Left-Fukuyama-ism. We accept the system it is with a little bit more justice, something more radical. But you know where I am? Nonetheless, why do I nonetheless remain in some sense a communist? I claim that precisely what you mentioned, refugees, ecology, I would add intellectual property, biogenetics, and so on, these are problems of commons. And we will have to reinvent some kind of large-scale collective decision. I have no idea how will it look. Only in this very vague sense, I remain a communist. Our problems are problems of commons, and it's clear that, for me, that if we keep just capitalism the way we have it, it reproduces itself and it doesn't allow us, for example, to confront ecological crisis. I agree that with proper taxation and so on, you can do things, but they are not enough. So, again, I agree with your diagnosis, but I think we should think, of course, nothing to do with 20th century communism that was ultimate failure and so on, but my God, problems are all the problems that you enumerated, refugees. These are problems of our commons. Are we segregated? How to bring us together? Ecology is the problem of our natural commons and so on and so on. Right. But it's a very open idea. And would you agree with me to go even further here? I claim that the last myth to be dropped is this leftist obsession with, after the left abandoned welfare state, radical left, and communism, state communism. I don't like this obsession with, you know, local democracy, immediate transparency, and so on. I don't think this works. We need large-scale decisions and so on. And even concretely, I know I repeat this line, but I like it. Imagine a society described by these partisans of local democracy, community, non-representational politics. It would be a nightmare.
Yes,
Every afternoon you have meetings. How do we educate our children? I want to live in a properly, nicely alienated society. Some invisible agencies provide water, healthcare, and so on. And the point is to fight for the right kind of alienation. My politics is, once I shocked my German friends, I gave an interview, they told me, you are critical of this or that, what's your model? I had well-structured alienation in an efficient bureaucratic socialism, and they didn't like it, as you can imagine.
Thank you.